my book is mostly about how our food system affects the climate.
Yes,
But the climate is also already
affecting the
affecting
food
our
system.
food system. We need pesticides to kill crops so that we can make more food with less land and feed the world and save the forests. The main climate problem from agriculture is also the main biodiversity problem from agriculture and the main, soil erosion problem from
Yeah.
agriculture and the main wetland destruction and deforestation. It's that we're eating the earth, that trying to decarbonize the planet while continuing to tear down forests for
Mhm.
agriculture is like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. We are tearing down a soccer field worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds for agriculture. Americans have actually already reduced our per capita beef consumption by
Mm.
about a third. Now, we didn't do it because we wanted to save the climate. We did it
Mhm.
because chicken got cheap. Agriculture and food is about a third of our climate problem,
Mhm.
and uh, and it only gets 3% of climate finance.
Mm.
And right now, almost all of it is going towards this regenerative agroecology stuff. And I think that's a little bit dangerous. Deforestation in Africa. If we don't increase yields
Mhm.
in Africa, just deforestation in Africa over the next 30 years could blow us past 2 degrees Celsius of warming.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. I'm your host, Professor of Climate Communication, and the host of Science Talk, Dr. Mohammed Ittifaq. In today's episode, we will be discussing food system, climate change, and environmental degradation. Today's episode guest is a journalist and New York Times best-selling author who recently wrote a book almost 7, 8 months ago, the book called We Are Eating the Earth: The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate. In this book, Michael explores how the global food system drives climate change, deforestation, and pollution, accounting for about a third of environmental destruction. It highlights the book, of course, the highlight the need to produce more food on less land, promoting innovations in agriculture, diet changes, specifically reducing beef, and smarter policies to secure sustainable future. Today, we will be asking what kind of sustainable future are we talking about? Because when we talk with ecologists or conservation biologists, they don't seem to like that term much. So today, we're going to be spending some time with Michael, as he has written a fantastic book and he's one of the bestseller author. And recently, according to him, on many podcasts he's been on, said that he didn't realize for many years or more than a decade that how beef actually important and how agriculture is driving climate change. So, Michael, without further ado, welcome to Science Talk.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So, we've been talking a little bit and had a little bit, hiccup with technology before we start recording this episode. But I wanted to start the episode asking you, and feel free if you have not read, or I'm sure you have, but did you read recent president executive order called "Promoting the National Defense by Ensuring an Adequate Supply Elemental Phosphorus and Glyphosate-Based Herbicides," of course, signed by President Trump recently last week, February 18? What do you think of the implication of that?
Well, as you know, a few months ago, I wrote a piece in the New York Times, where I'm a contributor,
Mhm.
and the headline was, something like spraying glyphosate on crops is
Mhm.
fine, really. Um, and it is. Look, I maybe take a quick step back, and I'm sure we'll get into this. But again, like you said, my book is about how we are eating the earth, about how our natural planet is becoming an agricultural planet. Our farms and pastures now cover 40% of the earth, of
Mhm.
the earth's land, and a huge environmental problem. It's the leading driver of deforestation, wetland destruction, biodiversity loss, water pollution, water shortages. And as you said, it's the main reason why our food system is now a third of our climate problem. Um, so that's the context to me. And then you have this question about glyphosate,
Mhm.
and you have a lot of people, including the president's health secretary, Bobby Kennedy, the sort of Joe Rogan types on the right, but also the sort of Michael Pollan and some environmentalists on the left who really just hate glyphosate. They
Mhm.
pretty much hate all chemicals. They hate that glyphosate is sprayed on GMO crops, right? Roundup ready crops, and they don't like GMOs very much. They're sort of pushing this kind of natural form of agriculture. And then you have President Trump and, and the Republican Party and some of his aides who are very pretty much pro chemical. If it's chemical, if it's provided by the chemical industry or the fossil fuel industry, the petrochemical industry, they're for it. So this executive order is essentially pretending that there's some gigantic glyphosate crisis, which there isn't. Nobody's, no, there's plenty of glyphosate available.
Mhm.
He's suggesting we're going to sort of have to make more. And there are a lot of lawsuits against pesticide companies, and this sort of suggests that there's going to be immunity for pesticide companies who make products like glyphosate. And of course, you have a lot of the sort of Maha moms, right? Make
Mhm.
America Healthy
Yes.
Again moms who are very upset about this because they hate glyphosate.
Mhm.
And I'm the schmuck in the middle, right?
Okay.
I'm the guy who's saying like, well, first of all, there's no reason for, an executive order like ramping up production of glyphosate or any other pesticide. Like it's perfectly possible to make them in the United States without an executive order.
Mhm.
This is just posturing. And even chemical companies, even though, again, I'm sort of a defender on the merits, like, they should be like any other company that makes a product. They should be subject to lawsuits if people think they're being, if they're being screwed by these products. This tries to bypass all that.
Mhm.
That said, glyphosate is just about the most benign herbicide or pesticide out there. And it's been approved by dozens of countries as perfectly safe. There are some researchers who have put out some studies claiming that it causes cancer, that it
Yeah.
causes hormone problems, all
Mhm.
kinds. But what those studies have in common is that first of all, they're not on humans. They're on mice, they're on rats,
Mhm.
and they basically bombard these poor animals with massive doses of glyphosate that you would never encounter in the real world. And people like my governor in Florida, DeSantis, and they're on an anti-glyphosate tear, and it's very much like his anti-vaccine tear,
Mhm.
where they're showing that there are these trace amounts of glyphosate in bread, and implying that that's why
Yeah.
people are sick. And that's just bogus. There's no
Yeah.
evidence of that. So I'm really trying to kind of tamp down this glyphosate hysteria.
Mhm.
And then, of course, Trump is out there basically, saying like, glyphosate is the greatest thing on earth, which is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it is a benign pesticide. We need pesticides to kill crops so that we can make more food with less land and feed the world and save the forests.
So that is more of a health. Yeah, I was watching since I was researching a little bit and reading about it, and algorithms these days suggest things, and Instagram showed me a food scientist video on that, and they were also going to different stores and check the level of bread, and there are ways to test. But like, is there any implication for soil health or environmental degradation of that, other than like within the food, but like for the agricultural practices? If it has anything to do with water pollution or like agricultural, like for the region specifically, which are more agricultural, like maybe Midwest.
Sure. I mean, look, I mean, glyphosate is what it is it's a phenomenal weed killer. It
Hmm.
kills plants. And one of the reasons it sort of has two special properties.
Hmm.
One is that it really kills plants.
Hmm.
And so it kills all the plants. So it kills all the weeds, but it can kill, sort of
Hmm.
beneficial plants that are in the soil. And that's why the GMO crops, they're modified so that they're resistant to glyphosate, to Roundup. And so they're Roundup ready. You spray it with Roundup and it kills everything else.
Hmm.
And and that's that helps the crop grow and it helps it resist weeds.
Yeah.
Now, a couple reasons that so that can be bad for some other plants,
Mm,
but some reasons that it's good is, first of all, glyphosate has generally, it replaces like a cocktail of all kinds of nasty chemicals
mm,
that are really much nastier, that you have to bomb entire fields with this stuff, and they kill not just not just plants, but earthworms and aphids and ladybugs and you name it.
mm,
And they can really be, some of them are quite harmful to humans as well.
mm,
Glyphosate, I think the evidence shows that it is not that. The other thing is that glyphosate is so good at killing weeds that you don't need to plow. So you see a lot of these, big farmers in the Midwest
mm.
who, they haven't read a lot of Michael Pollan.
Yeah.
They're not regenerative in any
Mhm.
way. They're not trying to be organic farmers. But one of the big regenerative principles is that you don't want to till the land so much because that
Mm,
really can cause a lot of erosion. And because of glyphosate, they don't have to. They're
mm,
going no-till or conservation tillage. So again, these are the advantages. These things, there are always trade-offs, but what has really bothered me about the whole fight about
mm,
glyphosate is that it's just become this like glyphosate's unnatural.
mm,
It's a weed killer. We use 300 million tons of it every year. Let's just get rid of it. And there hasn't been a lot of focus on, well, what would be the consequences of getting rid of it? What would it be
mm.
replaced with? There's just this kind of la 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 la. I'm not listening. I
Yeah.
would like I would like natural agriculture,
Yeah.
but the fact is, like, the reason we invented agriculture 12,000 years ago was because nature doesn't provide as much food as agriculture,
Mm,
and it has never been like entirely natural. And organic agriculture has some good things about it, but it generally has 20 to 40% lower yields, and that
mm.
means you need 20 to 40% more land to make the same amount of food. You eat 20 to 40% more of the earth, and that's an environmental cost that I
Mhm.
think, to getting rid of glyphosate, that a lot of people don't pay attention to.
Yeah, so you brought up pretty good, interesting points in the last on to answering that question at the end. So when I talk with ecologists or conservation biologists, they see ourselves as a part of a nature. That we are, as a humans, we are part of the ecosystem, and that's why we have to protect that. On the side, they also take the issue with the growing population and feeding those 10 billion bellies, in the 2050. And they seem to kind of argue that it's not sustainable, that we continue growing and growing. It is an endless growth kind of mindset. And they take, very specific issue with that, which I think to a certain extent will make sense, or to a large extent makes sense. So you
You mean the
dealt with.
population? You mean you're
Yes,
talking about
yes,
human
population.
population?
Yes. So there's like the population is growing and we're consuming everything more, right? And producing and consuming at the same time more. But you looked at this issue and you researched for this book for 5 years, if I'm not wrong.
That's right.
So our food system and how does it affect our climate? And I want you to kind of shed some light on that because regardless what type of food I eat, it's gonna grow somewhere, right? And the issue you took with it, and you said in a couple of podcasts that you have never thought much about the relationship between the both until recent time. But ordinary people like myself, I'm not a food scientist, so make like kind of a point for the audience that what is wrong with our food system, and you're arguing more food with less land. How's that gonna
Sure.
work?
So you mean the connection between our food and our climate?
Yes.
So I mean, look, some of it is like, obviously agriculture. You have like diesel tractors and those crop dusters that drop pesticides, those little planes, and other sort of fossil fueled farm equipment
Mhm.
that creates carbon emissions, and that's part of the problem if you're just talking about a climate.
Yeah.
And then you do have the cows
Mhm.
and sheep that burp and fart methane, and
Yes.
people laugh about that because it's
Yeah.
funny, but it also
Yeah.
is a real problem. That's
Yeah,
a
I
problem.
saw that on Daily Show when you were talking with, yes.
Yeah, exactly. exactly. Yeah, we talked about that because farts are funny.
Yeah.
And then you do have also the fertilizer is a very serious, synthetic fertilizer is literally made from natural gas, from fossil fuel, and that creates a fair amount of greenhouse gas emissions as well through nitrous oxide. But the main, I know I'm sort of a bore about this, but the main climate problem from agriculture is also the main biodiversity problem from agriculture, and the main, soil erosion problem from
Yeah.
agriculture, and the main wetland destruction and deforestation. It's that we're eating the earth.
Yeah.
It's that we keep tearing down more trees and wetlands to create more agriculture, and that is a huge environmental and climate problem. I always say that trying to decarbonize the planet while continuing to tear down forests for agriculture is like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. Because when you deforest a forest,
Yeah.
you lose all that carbon that was in the forest.
Of course.
It goes right up into the sky. But you cripple your ability to clean up so you're not just making a mess, you're also crippling your ability to clean up the mess,
Yeah.
because forests and wetlands already absorb about a quarter of the carbon that our fossil fuels are pumping into the sky. So they're not so good at doing that when you cut them down and get rid of them.
Yeah.
So again, this is the real climate connection to our forests. And of course, even if you don't care about all the bugs and bunnies and frogs and slugs in the forest, they are carbon sinks. They store a lot of carbon, and we are right now, we are tearing down a soccer field worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds for agriculture.
Which is
And
crazy.
and that's what's not sustainable. On our current trajectory, by 2050, we will deforest another dozen Californias worth of land. And we just don't have another dozen Californias worth of forest to spare. So that is, when people say it's unsustainable, that's what I'm talking about. It's we need to figure out a way to continue to feed a population that, as you said, is growing, may not be 10 billion by 2050, but, certainly 9.6, 9.7 billion. So we're going to need about 50% more calories by 2050, but we cannot use any more land. We cannot have more net deforestation, and we're going to have to reduce our agricultural emissions by about 80% if we want to hit those Paris targets.
And many scientists are arguing that that was not a feasible target when they set 10 years ago, and they knew it, but they still come up with that threshold. We're gonna miss that already because this is the last year was the third consecutive hottest year on the planet. So what are we gonna do? Like, if we do not have that much earth left, where we're gonna grow that much food, the population is growing, and we haven't come up with more sustainable practice. And we have universities, scientists who are working on these issues, constantly. And on the other hand, there's policymakers who are deciding things, right? Sometimes based on research studies, but sometimes not based on research studies. So what are we going to do if we do not have enough food to feed people?
Well, the first thing I will say is that we shouldn't just look at these numbers and say like, oh my gosh, we're missing our targets. So, screw it, we're doomed. Because there really isn't, it's not like, I think our next target is we're supposed to reduce emissions 43% from 2005 levels by 2030, right? But it's not like, if we reduce it 44%, everything's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
And if we reduce it 42%, that doesn't mean like the world is screwed. There's no such thing as sort of like, it's not a pass-fail test. There's only better and worse, and better is better than worse. So to bring it back to this food problem, look, I write in the book about sort of dozens of really promising potential solutions on the supply side and the sort of making food, and on the demand side in terms of how we can, eat less land-intensive diets. But the honest truth is that none of these solutions really have much traction yet, right? So the answer to your question is, to quote the main, sort of protagonist of my book, and I hope I can say this on your podcast, but his line is, we need to hurry the up and figure out. Right? We need to research. We need to figure out what works. And then we need to deploy
Yeah.
that works,
Hmm.
what works. And so I think, on the demand side, the stuff I write about are the two big problems with our diets. Like, you can talk about, there are a million ways our diets impact the climate,
Yes.
but the two big ones are eating meat,
Hmm.
and particularly beef,
Hmm.
and other ruminants, and wasting food, because
Hmm.
we waste like a quarter of our food. That means we waste a quarter of the land we use to grow the food,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
we use a land mass the size of China to grow garbage. It would be way better if that was, reforested, or,
Yeah.
or growing like food that we can actually use. So these are and again, beef is a real baddie. Meat in general is way less efficient from a land perspective. It takes like 9 calories worth of plants you have to feed to a chicken to get 1 calorie worth of meat,
Mm.
and that's because you have to support the beaks and the feathers and the clucking and the pooping and all kinds of other things that don't
Yeah.
make meat. And then cattle are like 10 times worse. They use 10 times as much land per calorie,
Mm.
and they produce 10 times as many emissions. So on the demand side, you want to work on whether it's, you know, education and public policy, or, the one I'm people are very excited about, and I am too, even though it's been struggling, is sort of alternative proteins, meat substitutes made out of plants or made out of fungi or even made out of animal cells,
Mm.
where you can, replace animal agriculture but still have meat because people really love meat.
Yes,
And
they
then
do.
on the supply side, you have all kinds of, whether it's GMOs, but even more exciting is kind of gene editing,
Hmm.
to try to maybe have more drought tolerant or heat tolerant or higher yielding crops, or even
Yeah.
livestock. You have alternative pesticides that use the RNA technology behind the COVID vaccines to constipate beetles to death. You have alternative fertilizers that use gene edited microbes to snatch nitrogen out of the air and feed it to crops. I talked to scientists at the
Mhm.
University of Illinois who are trying to reinvent photosynthesis,
Mm.
right? Which has been doing a pretty good
Yeah.
job maintaining life on Earth for 3 billion years,
Yeah.
but turns out to be pretty inefficient in making food. So they're using artificial intelligence and gene editing and CRISPR and big data and all kinds of technology to try to engineer away some of those
Mm.
inefficiencies. And they think they can increase crop yields 50% over 20 years. So the answer is we need to do all of those things. We need to figure out what works, and then we've got to deploy them, because we're not going to solve the problem tomorrow, and we're not
Mhm.
going to solve the problem in 5 years.
Yeah.
But it's like in the land sector, right? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now.
Yeah.
So this is we've made. I do like to point out that, like, when I started covering climate 20
Mhm.
years ago, I was mostly writing about energy, and there
Yeah.
were no alternatives to fossil fuels. They
Mm.
were just like farm grown biofuels, and it turns out they're a terrible solution. But today, 95% of all new power plants are zero emission. They're
Yeah.
wind or solar or nuclear. So things can change. Um,
And yeah,
we
I
just got
mean
to change
that.
it.
So we have something. Some people take issue with that. Recently, when I had conversation with Bill McKibben, that we have some technology, we can do things, and some people took a very serious issue on my YouTube. Just like absolutely, it's a BS. We do not have. I mean, those people, I respect their point of view. Like they are entitled to their opinions. But on the other hand, I wanted to ask you about, like, a lot of people also in my comment section talk about go vegan or become a vegetarian to solve some of the problems, now if not all. So how would you characterize? And I know you mentioned your diet in a couple of
Yep.
other podcasts, and I don't eat red meat at all.
Right.
It's been years. I have eaten, or maybe like eat once a year. When we sacrifice animals as Muslims, to honor the Abraham practices. So how does it help, and how does it help to become a vegan and solve that climate or maybe a diet problem?
It absolutely helps. And,
Mhm.
I think, veganism it's the best diet for the planet. There's
Mhm.
there's no question, because, as I said, you know livestock are, I've talked about how much agricultural land we use. Well,
Mhm.
more than 3/4 of that land is either pasture land or it's growing crops that we feed to animals before we eat them.
Mm.
So there's no, this is a land problem, but it's predominantly a meat problem. And
Mm.
if you're not eating meat and dairy, again, dairy is really bad too. It's not,
Mm.
cows, because cows are bad. I
Yeah.
mean, they produce milk like three
Mhm.
times a day, while
Yeah.
they only produce beef like once in their lifetime. So
Yeah.
beef is even worse. And that's why my diet, I've cut out beef and lamb. And for most people, that's about as good for the planet as going vegetarian, because most
Mhm.
vegetarians eat more dairy.
Yeah.
But yes, anything you can do is helpful. And where I just where a lot of vegans are angry at me is they'll just say like, this is a simple problem,
Mm.
people just need to stop eating meat. And I'm like, yeah, it's great, but that's not simple.
It's
The
not.
world
Yeah.
the world ate 400 million tons of meat last year, and you can't just say like, you know let's just not.
Mm.
That's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
people love meat. We
Mhm.
we sort of start our ancestors started eating it 2 million years ago, and we really kind of evolved to enjoy the taste. That's when
Yeah.
our brains started getting big, and
Yeah.
our stomachs started getting smaller because we didn't have to eat as many plants.
Yeah.
And I just think these kind of these easy solutions are
Mhm.
just not so easy.
Yeah.
So that's why I do say that, like, then people get upset because I say we have to think about the supply side too, and we need to make more food with less land, and that sometimes leads in uncomfortable directions for people who would like all agriculture to kind of be like nature, or be like gardens, or be rustic and pastoral and no chemicals, and the animals have names instead of numbers, and
Mhm.
the soil is treated with love. But again, if that's only making half as much food per acre, it means needs twice as many acres to make food. So I do think we need to think about both the demand side and the supply side. But if you are vegan, you are like, you're part of the solution, and that's great. The problem is that, less than 1% of, the 8 billion of us are vegan. So
Yeah, that's true. And its population is growing. So is it possible that we grow our own food and not depend on these big producers or these corporations to use more land and waste? And if we produce maybe own food, we will waste less. Would that work?
I mean, again, these are all things that at the margins, it's like if you want to have a vegetable garden, that's awesome.
Mhm.
But if the average American eats the equivalent of 3 burgers a week, and I don't think they're going to grow that at home,
No.
you know. And look, and if it
Yeah.
was only 2 burgers a week, we
Mhm.
would save a Massachusetts worth of land every year. So
Wow.
these dietary choices make real difference. Or if
Yeah.
if the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger, if they get good enough and cheap enough, right now they're almost as good and just a little bit more expensive than animal meat, but that's not really a business model. So people
Yeah.
aren't really buying them enough. Beyond Meat's stock has gone from $250 a share to $2 a share. I think, the hope is that they'll get better, they'll get cheaper, they'll get
Mhm.
even healthier, and then people will buy them. But I don't think that, vegan activists have been sort of shaking their fingers at us and saying meat is murder. And also, in their defense, like
Mhm.
providing a lot of education about some of the terrible things that happen inside factory farms.
Yeah.
And they've been doing that for decades, but we still eat more meat every
Yeah.
year. And the expectation, particularly in the developing world, as people start to escape poverty, the first thing people tend to do when they stop being poor is they start eating meat. And we're expected to eat another about 70% more meat as a species by 2050. So, you know, I think
So,
just
so the
saying
picture,
don't
but
do
we,
that is
yeah.
not.
And you still, so the statistics you're like telling the audience or me, they're shocking, honestly. But you also say saving our climate. Why do you still believe that we can save our planet by making these dietary choices, or in other way, or using less land? when you, on the other hand, you see few companies are responsible more for, emissions, or regardless of it's agricultural or, other productions or other fossil fuel use. So, and it's hard to change diet. It's hard to change behavior. That's the one of the hardest things to do. And Americans don't like to see when somebody else tell them to do something. So,
That's for
the
sure.
freedom. So, I mean, like, how do you still believe that we can save our climate?
That's a great. Well, you're certainly right that look, I interviewed a pollster for this book,
Mhm.
and I asked him about taxes on meat would be one, just like people are always talking about taxes on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I was like, and he said he actually once polled that, and it was the least popular policy he had ever polled. He said
Mm.
his quote was that it was like veterans benefits for ISIS.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not trying, but so this is going to be hard. But if it were easy, somebody would have done it already. And here's an example of like,
Mhm.
if you want to talk about, why I'm optimistic, because it
Mhm.
is a very big problem.
Yeah, it
But
is.
really a shocking amount of it, not like not like two-thirds of it, but
Mhm.
like a big chunk of it is a beef problem, right?
Mhm.
In the United States, half of our agricultural land is used to make beef, and we
Mhm.
only get 3% of our calories from it. So if
Oh,
you say,
wow.
okay, well, let's look at the beef problem. Well, how could you
Mhm.
fix that? Well, for one thing, since over the last half century, Americans have actually already reduced our per capita beef consumption by
Mhm.
about a third. Now, we didn't do it because we wanted to save the climate. We did it
Mhm.
because chicken got cheap.
Yeah.
Um, but it shows that things can change. And that one change has probably done more to reduce our emissions than any change until before the rise of solar.
Mhm.
So, and then I see these, so like I've tasted a cultivated meat burger made out of animal cells, and it was great. And I
Mhm.
see they've already reduced their costs like 99.9%. Not enough.
Mhm.
But so someday I could imagine people eating at least blended burgers or,
Mhm.
so I could see a path to less beef consumption. The average American eats 4 times the global average.
Mhm.
There's room for improvement. And then on the production side, when I went to Brazil, I saw some terribly degraded ranches where they'd have like, one cow for every 5 acres, and the cows looked like they were on hunger strikes.
Mhm.
But then I saw some ranches where they had upgraded them, and it
Mhm.
wasn't like these massive, high tech, crazy upgrades. They did. They did rotational grazing, and they integrated their cattle with their cover crops in ways that Michael Pollan would like a lot. But
Mhm.
then they also fertilized their pastures, and they had industrial feedlots that Michael
Mhm.
Pollan wouldn't like at all. But the point is, they spent maybe a couple $1,000s per acre, and and with that change, they were able to have one cow per acre and
Mhm.
instead of one cow for every 5 acres. So they were
Yeah.
5 times as productive. And and that meant they were only using 1/5 as much of the Amazon. And
Mhm.
so if beef was only 2 times as bad as chicken instead of 10 times as bad,
Yeah.
we would eat a lot less of the earth.
Mhm.
So I do think like look, beef alternatives and pasture intensification are just two of the kind of solutions that I'm talking about. You've also got feed additives that'll help cows burp less methane, and and all kinds of manure management technologies that will reduce nitrous oxide emissions. There's all kinds of things, but just in general, I feel like as a species, we're maybe not great at making sacrifices for the planet, but
Mhm.
we are awesome at inventing stuff. And we are pretty good at solving problems when we set our minds to it, when we
Mhm.
focus.
Yeah.
So
That
I'm the
that
guy
that's
kind of,
true.
yeah, I'm the guy kind of banging my spoon in my high chair saying, like, focus.
Yeah.
And, we'll see.
Yeah, and I mean, like maybe as some people, some ecologists argue that because we have, removed ourselves from the nature, as a human, so maybe we see less connection and more of living in the bigger cities and don't see birds and the other animals and go for hiking and other things. Maybe that is a part of the problem. Maybe less people care about, and but now I think that I see young generations, young people, they do care. There are more ethics. There are more, kind of care about the ecological systems and ecosystem and other, habitats around us, which is really encouraging. Um,
That's right.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
you
you don't
also,
have to, right? You don't have to like live in nature
yeah,
to
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of appreciate some of this stuff,
Mhm,
right? Like when we're talking about the future of our planet,
mhm.
and it's like a nice planet,
It is.
right?
It
It's
is.
it's like the only planet with pizza and
Yes.
like, and good Wi-Fi and, and air that we can breathe.
Yeah.
So I think like, the incentives are pretty good to try to save it, whether you live in, in rural areas or
Mhm.
suburban areas or urban areas. We can all see when we take a flight across the country,
Yeah.
you see all those rectangles and circles, and it's like, oh, there's like, agriculture is kind of taken over.
Yeah.
Um, and in some of the developing world, it's, it's taking over even faster. So I think like, we can realize that it's a problem, and then once we realize it's a problem, we can maybe try to fix it.
Yeah.
And we're not gonna, not everything's going to be hunky dory, and it's not going to be like, oh, good, emissions go down to zero tomorrow, and we can go, think about other things.
Yeah.
But I
No.
think, we can avoid some of the worst case scenarios that would really suck for our children.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, I think I will give credit to Peter Brannon and Elizabeth Colbert. She said like this planet is beautiful, it's interesting, and this is our only home, and we should care and love, the earth and its systems and what it has to offer us. We
yeah,
should be doing that more. So you also
Mars,
talk,
right? Like
yeah,
they're talking about like we're going to go to Mars. Like,
yeah,
no, no, let's save this place.
yes,
This
the only one
place
we
is like
have.
really good.
Yeah. So
It's
there's a lot of discussion. You have talked about regenerative agriculture, and some of my students also talked about in classes. So can you tell a little bit more about that? And what do you think of that?
Sure. So, yeah, a lot of the regenerative movement is upset at me because of my focus on high yields,
Hmm.
right? This idea that we need to make more food with less land, and that is not always the approach of regenerative. Like I said, some regenerative practices can contribute to kick-ass yields, but in general, while my focus is like, how can we make more food on the farmland we already have, so that we don't need more farmland.
Hmm.
The regenerative movement is really about trying to restore the soil, and maybe like creating more natural farming, so it's so that the farmland we're using has is kind of more biodiverse and healthier, even if we need more of it. So that's where we've ended up kind of having some fights. And so look, like regenerative practices, like it means like cover crops to try to keep
Hmm.
the soil covered all the time, reduce tillage so you're not disturbing the soil as much. You're integrating the livestock with the crops. You're trying to use fewer chemicals. And these are the kind of basic regenerative practices, and so like it's often very good for the soil. Like I went to Tom Steyer's ranch, the guy who ran
Yeah,
for
yeah.
president. He's now
Hmm.
running for governor, and he has a and I saw like since it went regenerative, he had like much less soil erosion. He had much more biodiversity of the grasses, a lot of native grasses coming back to his ranch. One problem is that first of all, he had very low stocking rates. So again, he was making less food with more land than a conventional ranch. I think it was about a fourth of the sort of standard stocking rate, which means he would have needed 4 times as much land to make the same amount of beef as a conventional ranch. But the other problem is that, if you've seen movies like Kiss the Ground or
Hmm.
Common Ground or Carbon Cowboys,
Yeah.
there's this idea that if you practice regenerative agriculture, all that sort of nasty carbon that we pumped up into the sky is going to be magically repatriated, is good soil carbon in our agricultural soils, and it'll be sequestered there, and even the farmers can get paid for saving carbon. And that, unfortunately, the science is really terrible. And what Steyer found was actually he had less soil carbon in
Hmm.
in his ranch, and that's pretty consistent with, the science has just been terrible on this stuff. When you do see the increases in soil carbon, it's usually just because they moved cows from one place to another. And so there's more soil carbon over here, but there's less over there. So it's kind of a shell game. Basically, soil carbon is very difficult to measure. If you do add a little soil carbon to your soil, it's very hard to make sure that it stays there. And really to add more carbon to the soil, you usually have to add more nitrogen to the soil,
Hmm.
and that creates all kinds of other climate
Other
problems.
problems.
So I do think some of this regenerative movement has wildly overstated, this idea that, they are going to transform agriculture from a, climate problem to a climate solution. They're going to like kiss the ground says that just better farming is going to reverse global warming, that you can store 55 gigatons of carbon every year. And that is just, pun intended, that's bullshit.
No, it's
Um,
not
and
working.
so, uh, and so there, I really have gotten into some squabbles with the movement. But again, I think it's, you know, I'm, uh, I'm, I'm not, I'm not dumping on it as an agricultural practice, but I am dumping on it as a climate solution. And one thing that worries me
Mhm.
is that, right now, cli- you know, agriculture and food is about a third of our climate problem,
Mhm.
and it only gets 3% of climate finance.
Mm.
And right now, almost all of it is going towards this regenerative agroecology stuff. So it's not going towards all those other solutions that I was talking about. And I think that's a little bit dangerous.
So the way we made these choices, on the one hand, we all have those testing of the soil and the soil health and also the food we are growing. Why do we need to grow more food on less land instead of reverse that idea that we do not have too many humans on this planet, and have more of a practices like control the population, not to have the explosion of population. We have to grow. So why do you think we have to grow more food in less land instead of the other way around?
Well, the first question I guess I'd be like, because there are already 8 billion of us.
Yes.
They're on track to have 9.5. Who do you want to kill?
I don't want to kill anybody, no.
Right. I mean, it's like, how are you going to cull this population? Now,
Mhm.
it does turn out now. So to take the argument a little more seriously, now it is true that there are ways that we can affect birth rates. And
Mhm.
I'm certainly not one of these people, what are they called? Like pronatalists who
Mhm.
are like, we need more children. We need more children.
Yeah.
I mean, me personally, I have two kids, and for me, they've been like the most important and wonderful thing in my life. And I would never tell anybody to, have
Not
kids
having
or
kids.
not have kids. I feel like that's, one of the awesome things about being a human is that we can. That said, there are, that we know how to reduce birth rates in places where they're super high. And it's
Mhm.
things like educating girls,
Mhm.
reducing infant mortality. So families don't feel like they have to have 8 kids just to
Mhm.
make sure that two
They do
survive.
survive, yeah.
Um, and then some of the kind of reproductive health and contraception and making sure that that's available. And that has worked magic in getting birth rates towards replacement rates, or it's like 2.1 per woman, pretty much all over the world, right? Like
Yeah.
not, it's like in Bangladesh, in
Yeah.
Iran, in Mexico. It's like it seems to work in Botswana. It seems to
Mhm.
work everywhere.
Yeah.
And right now, most of the world is heading towards replacement birth rates. Sub-Saharan Africa is a real exception. Now,
Mhm.
to that's the sort of context, and I'm all for that. It'd be great. Voluntary reductions through good public policy. That's awesome. But here's the thing
Mhm.
for the question you asked. Let's imagine that we did all those things, and by 2050, all over the world, birth rates were reduced to replacement rates. Well, that would reduce the amount of food we would need by 2050 by about 4%.
Mhm.
Partly because right now there are already so many women of childbearing age because of previous high birth rates
Mhm.
that it's really kind of baked into the cake. Now, by
Mhm.
2100, it really would make a difference. But if we are serious, climate is a sort
Yeah.
of now problem
Mhm.
that we really need to make progress over the next few decades. And population control is not really going to be the lever
Mhm.
that is going
Mhm.
to make the progress. We like, even if like, we should try to make progress on these, on birth rates through voluntary good public policy measures that that help the poor and help public health. But but we shouldn't. We're still going to need to make more food with less land and less
This land.
mess.
So I'm gonna ask you two more questions before I let you go.
Sure.
One of the things is the flooding, right? The flooding is destroying the crops all over the world. Heat waves, and we do not have crops, resistant crops, which are resistant to this climate, natural disaster, man-made disasters, I would say. I shouldn't call it natural disasters. And specifically in global south, many of the countries in the south, they do not have that technology. They do not have resistant crops. How much of that of a burden on our food systems when it comes to the calamities or natural disasters, and how does that impact?
You're making a great point. I'm glad you brought it up because look, my book is mostly about how our food system affects the climate,
Yes,
but the climate is also already
affecting the
affecting
food.
our food system,
Yeah.
and it's a real problem, right? It's all of the things I talked about how we need to make more food with less land.
Mhm.
Well, droughts and floods and heat waves, and also agricultural pests moving
Mhm.
to colder regions and diseases moving to colder regions, as they heat up. These are all going to make the job harder. And I
Mhm.
should say, like, and some of the technologies that we had in the green revolution, like you take like large scale irrigation, that was one way we've been able to increase, we've tripled our crop and livestock yields since the 1960s, and that's
Mhm.
incredible. But we're going to have to increase yields even more over the next 30 years than we have over the last 60 years. And it's going to be a lot harder in a warmer world, in a world where 90% of the world already has large scale irrigation projects.
Mhm.
So it's like, how far are we going to expand that? Where most of the world already has synthetic fertilizer.
Mhm.
So there's only so much that can do. And you're right, it's going to hit hardest in the developing world. In Africa, Africa is on track. Deforestation in Africa, if we don't increase yields
Mhm.
in Africa, just deforestation in Africa over the next 30 years could blow us past 2 degrees Celsius of warming, even if we stopped all other emissions
Other emissions.
everywhere else. Just
Um,
deforestation in Africa,
mhm.
which is, so I don't have like awesome ideas on this, although, as I mentioned, gene editing can really help
Mhm.
with some of these, the idea that we can adapt our crops to warmer temperatures, to drought, to less water, and try to have higher yields. But you are just right to flag it
Mhm.
as a kind of drag on everything I'm talking about. I think we're probably going to need to increase wheat yields by like at least 40% by at least say 2060.
Mhm.
But the current scientists are warning that because of that climate change could
Mhm.
reduce wheat yields by
Yeah.
30%.
Yes, there,
And
there
so
are
we're
many
going to have to
studies
do
showing that.
yeah, so we're going to
Yeah.
have to do even so that's just going to make it even harder, and we're
Mm.
going to have even more we're going to need even more technological breakthroughs. And but again, it's like, it comes back to
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's going to be hard, but we don't really have a choice. We got to
Choice.
we got to try to do it.
Yeah. So the solution, the type of solutions you propose in your book, is there enough support for those ideas in terms of technological, in terms of money, in terms of trying those things out or experimenting those things? Are like things happening, or what kind of support do you see? Because often people have ideas and they have solutions, but there's not enough money to put those solutions into practice.
I mean, right now the general answer is like, no, it's been a disaster. There's been almost no progress. There's been almost no money.
Mhm.
We really haven't started trying to fix this problem like we have started trying to fix the energy problem.
Mhm.
But because I don't want to be Debbie Downer, let me maybe I can leave you with a bit of good news, which is
Mhm.
that now Denmark. Now I know they're like the model nation, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like they're the happiest, they're the healthiest, they're the
Yeah.
everybody looks good, but so Denmark basically passed, I like to call it kind of the Michael Grunwald Agricultural Reform Act of 2025.
Mhm.
It's sort of like they're doing all the things. Well, not quite all the things,
Yeah.
because what a lot of enviros wanted there
Mhm.
is they were like, oh, this is terrible. We have this big pork industry, we have a big dairy industry, too much poop, too much burping and farting.
Mhm.
Like let's cull half the herd.
Mm.
And that would have been a disaster. I mean, it would have been nice for Denmark, maybe, but it wouldn't have changed anything globally.
Yeah.
It just would have meant moving more agricultural production to the developing world and that outsourcing their pollution and outsourcing their deforestation and outsourcing their emissions. But they didn't do that.
Yeah.
What they did instead is kind of all the other things. So they had a tax on agricultural emissions, and particularly like the burping cows,
Hmm.
and so that's disincentive towards emissions. At the same time, they are going to invest in technologies that can help farmers reduce their emissions, like the kind of like gene edited feed crops that can be drought tolerant and higher yielding, like you discussed, or feed additives that will help the cows burp less methane, like I mentioned. They're going to invest in that and make Denmark into a real kind of laboratory. At the
Hmm.
same time, they are going to try to rewild 1 million acres of marginal farmland back to nature, turn them back into
Hmm.
wetlands and forests, so that can help store up some carbon,
Yeah.
even though they're not reducing their agricultural production. They're also going to promote plant-based eating. They're going to
Hmm.
try to reduce food waste, and they're going to invest in
Hmm.
alternative proteins, the kind of fake meat and cultivated meat that can help reduce demand for animal agriculture. So
That's
they're
good.
doing all the things. The enviros ended up supporting it. The
Mhm.
farmers ended up supporting it. And I was going to say it was bipartisan, but I think they have three major parties in Denmark, so it was tripartisan.
Tripartism.
Everybody went on it. So again, it's Denmark, but it
Yeah.
shows that it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so hopefully that'll be a good, look, it's only 6 million people in Denmark, so
Hmm.
it's not going to change the emissions trajectory of the planet,
Significantly. Yeah.
but maybe it will be a laboratory that'll
Yeah.
show the rest of the world how to get this stuff done.
Absolutely. So my last question, what is something you think as an author, we are eating the earth, we need to talk more as a society and we're not spending as much time as we should?
Huh. Well, that's a great question. I guess and this maybe I'm reacting to what's been happening lately, and this goes back to your first question. But I do think there's this real movement, um, and you see it on the left, you see it on the right, but there's this idea that, and particularly when we think about our food, right? Because we vote on these issues three
Yeah,
times a day.
absolutely. Yeah.
Um, but there's become this idea that where it's like it needs to be natural.
Hmm.
Everything needs to be natural, and if it's
Yeah.
not natural, it's bad.
It's bad. Yes.
Um, and uh, and I just think there's like the science doesn't back that really. And
Hmm.
and look, like if we had natural, like people talk about like GMOs are unnatural, or using glyphosate as a
Hmm.
natural, like if you look at the corn that indigenous people grew in America, a few hundred years ago, it looks absolutely nothing like modern corn. We've been unnaturally breeding it and changing it for decades and centuries even. And what we've done is we've made it, much more productive and to feed a lot more people. A lot of people thought we were going to have these like horrible famines and where the entire world was going to run out of food. And that hasn't happened. When we do have famines, it's mostly because of distributional and government issues. So I do think, you see it certainly with the Maha movement,
Hmm.
this idea that like vaccines are bad,
Yeah.
pesticides are bad,
Hmm.
chemicals are bad, everything is bad. We need to go back to the old ways. But
Yeah.
again,
Yeah,
I
everything is bad other than sniffing the coke out of your toilet seat. Everything else is bad. So
that's exactly
we
right.
yeah,
I just
we have
I
to leave it there. Thank you so much, Mike. Once
uh,
again, coming on the show. I will highly recommend to my audience to read the book if you haven't, or order the book. We are eating the earth: the race to fix our food system and save our climate. Mike, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much.